Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be talking about right-of-way and the controversy that surrounds it in the world of HEMA. Now, a lot of people think they know what right-of-way is, do know what right-of-way is, or have only really maybe heard about it. But recently I fought at a right-of-way tournament in Philly, and I wanted to talk about its impact in HEMA and specifically how, no, it is not ruining HEMA. But in order to talk about it, first I have to describe what right-of-way is. And I'm going to do it very quickly and simplistically. Right-of-way is, and only is, a system of rules that determines a victor in the event of a double hit. That's all that it does. It doesn't determine how many points a target is worth, which points are on target, or anything like that. All it does is assign a priority and give someone a point when both fencers hit each other at more or less the same time. And it does this by assigning priority in two distinct actions. One, were you attacking? And did you parry? You are considered an attacker in right-of-way if you give your opponent one of these. Gesture that you are going to attack, either by moving your feet forward, or your body forward, or your weapon forward. Similarly, you are not the attacker if you are doing the opposite, moving backwards, cowering, and trying not to get hit. However, you can regain priority by parrying. If someone comes at you with an attack and then you parry it or block it or otherwise cause it to miss or not be successful, congratulations, you now have priority back. And if you then return with your own attack, you will have priority in the event, again, that both of you hit each other at the same time. And that's all there is to it. So the idea off the bat that this is going to ruin HEMA seems a little silly, but let's look at some concrete examples of how this plays out in a real tournament. So for our first exchange, we're going to start off with a really, really simple one. I come forward into measure, I feint an attack on my opponent's left side, I then cut around, throwing a cut on my opponent's right side, and hit them in the hand. Nothing really complicated here. It's no double, but what I want to break down here is exactly how the attack and a priority system would have worked if, say, for example, my opponent had hit me back at the exact same time. What we see here from our good friend Stephen Chaney is that he is doing a couple of gestures when he is judging and directing this particular exchange. And what these hand gestures are meaning are telling you who the priority was and what the flow of the exchange was. You see him gesture towards me, essentially saying that I was the attacker, which you can see here because I moved forward and gestured forward with my sword with the attack. And then you see him point to my opponent saying, counterattack, no. And what that means is that despite the fact that my opponent didn't throw anything at me, if he had, he would have lost priority, and thus no matter what happens, I was going to get the point for this exchange. So if you imagine a theoretical scenario where right as I hit my opponent in the hand, he threw his own cut and hit me back, I would have still received the point. So for our next exchange, we have another very basic example. We have a very simple parry riposte. I kind of back my opponent towards the edge of his ring. He throws an attack. I parry at my upper left side, throw a left spare cut to the head, something that I like to do all the time. And when we separate, you see Chaney once again throwing out these hand signs, trying to say exactly what happened during the exchange. Although what you see is he points toward my opponent, saying he attacked. He then points toward me, saying I parried and riposted, and then awards me the point. A simple exchange with a simple outcome. But again, if we were in a theoretical scenario where after I had parried my opponent's strike, he had simply pulled off and maybe middle-howed me in the body, as you sometimes see in tournaments, I still would have gotten the point because I had the last parry, and thus I had priority when the double theoretically occurred. So now we're going to get into some exchanges where actual doubles happen. So for this exchange, we see a very similar setup to the last one. My opponent gets a little bit of distance, switches into a kind of bicorno thrusting stance, and then drives the point directly towards my face, at which point I attempt to parry and riposte. And what you see here is a clear example of what would be considered in most other tournament rule sets a double. My opponent, as you can see by the footage, does successfully stab me in the face, just as I set it aside with my Zverkow attack, glancing it off of my head barely, and then delivering a counterattack. And what this means is that The points are going to be awarded based on who had priority going into this double. As you can see from Cheney's gestures, he points at my opponent saying that he had the attack. And this is because in order to prepare for the attack, where he switched up into his high Bicorno stance and drove the point towards my face, he had the forward momentum. I did not counter by throwing any sort of attack of my own. I very clearly intended to try to parry the attack that he was throwing, which means that I wanted to be able to parry it so that I would get priority, and he wanted to land it so that he would keep priority. Of course, based on the footage, we now know that he did in fact land his attack, which means despite the fact that I was unsuccessful in my parry but successful in my counterattack, he gets to keep the priority and keep the point because we both hit each other at more or less the same tempo. For our next exchange, we have another very similar situation to the exchange before. My opponent comes in with a thrust, I attempt to parry it off, and then throw a counter, and this time a rather vertical Zverkow. But what's worth noting is that we see the opposite interaction and the opposite result as the previous exchange, where before my opponent was successful in landing his thrust, this time he is not successful, which means my parry gives me priority. And that priority is important because immediately as I parry my opponent's blade offline and attempt to throw my Zverkow down onto the top of their shoulder, my opponent does something very similar. After I have pushed them off to the side, they flip their sword upside down and throw a kind of plunging cut with their short edge down towards my own shoulder. And the reason this is important is because this, in a lot of cases, could be considered a double. And in a lot of other systems of HEMA, what this would come down to is the priority and the target value. But in this case, what it comes down to is the fact that I had successfully defended myself immediately before the double happened, and thus I deserve priority. And what it's worth talking about right now is that right-of-way attempts to, like all HEMA rule sets, get a particular kind of fencing to happen. And that particular kind of fencing is very back and forth, in the pocket, parry repost style fencing. And that's not necessarily the kind of fencing that a lot of people learn how to do. But I find it ironic because for all the controversy that surrounds right-of-way rule sets, it does seem like a lot of the people, especially on YouTube, who like to put up demonstrations of their own fencing also seem to highly value this parry repost style of fencing exchange. They value people who can appropriately defend themselves. And if you've ever had somebody complain that your fencing or somebody else's fencing was too doubly, well, it seems to me that this is exactly the kind of rule set that they would like. Because, as it turns out, one of the ways that you can stop people from being too doubly is to punish them every time they double in a disadvantageous position. The disadvantageous position here meaning either they were not the initial attacker, so they made a conscious decision to simply counterattack without any forward momentum, or they had just been successfully parried and they realized that they were probably going to get hit, and rather than defending themselves, tried to get some points of their own. We see this come about in rule sets that are typically described as Nordic style. Nordic style because it kind of originated with swordfish, though who can really say where it actually started? But the point is that in rule sets like that, people tend to get points based on what they hit, regardless of whether or not they were in a disadvantageous or advantageous position. Meaning that a lot of people will throw Hail Mary cuts to the body or the head, or thrusts to the body or the head, even if they get parried, particularly because what it allows them to do is double out their opponent's points and allow things to stay neutral, thus making it so that any exchange in which they get parried, they can kind of bail their way out of to being neutral again without losing anything. What this rule set does is it punishes people who do that by forcing parries to concede priority, and by forcing defensive motions to, in the initial action, concede priority. So that there are two ways to play the game to come out on top, but neither one of them completely favors one or the other, at least for now. So for our next exchange, we get into the weeds of what I think is the reason that people don't really like right-of-way. And what I have to do is I have to assume that this footage is a little bit different. I didn't have a great example of what I want to talk about here, primarily because there were rules in this tournament that prevented it from happening. But what I want you to imagine is, as you've watched this exchange, imagine that my opponent managed to throw their Krumpau, only they managed to hit me in the leg. And the reason I want you to imagine this is because this exchange shows a pretty good example of what it looks like when right-of-way gets a little bit into the weeds when it comes to attack priority. So, as we can tell from the rules that we've gone over in the previous exchanges, my opponent is the one to initiate the action with their forward movement and their forward, blade attack. However, you can see that I, upon seeing my opponent springing off to their right side, decides to throw a counterattack and try to hand snipe them and then move backwards out of action. Now, in this case, I was successful in doing that. I'm the only one to land an attack, so right-of-way doesn't come into play. However, if we want to imagine that my opponent was successful in hitting me in the leg, we have to have a conversation about attack priority again. Namely, that because my opponent had initiated the action, they would have priority, and that means that Crump-style attack that we are theoretically saying hit my leg would have retained attack priority, and despite the fact that I had struck my opponent in the arms, or even theoretically anywhere for that matter, he would have kept attack priority and he would have gotten the point. And this is where people start to have a problem with right-of-way rule sets, and particularly when they watch Olympic fencing and they see some extraordinarily wacky things going on. Because when they watch Olympic fencing, they see Olympic fencers doing crazy stuff like leaping into the air, diving onto the floor, going into the deepest lunges you've ever seen, snapping their ankles, it looks like, and then delivering some low line touch point, then pulling off their mask and screaming. What we see are people demonstrating the power of attack priority when you know how to properly disguise your attack and touch, or in this case, hit, a place that's particularly hard to defend. Now, in this theoretical example, someone can do, similar to Olympic fencers, jump offline, maybe even jump onto the ground, throw one-handed attacks, any of the wacky and questionably martial things you think exist in HEMA that you don't like. Imagine my opponent did that while moving forward, and you can immediately see why people have a problem. They don't want exchanges to look like somebody dolphin diving onto the ground and trying to snipe at your ankles. Because in attack priority, regardless of how hard I hit them on the top of the head as they try to do this, they will retain their points. Meaning that in order to use right-of-way properly in HEMA, in my opinion, and in the opinion of this tournament organizer, you need to have a system of target priority as well. Now, this target priority is something that we already have in a lot of HEMA tournament rule sets. For example, in the Nordic model, which is probably the most common model that people use, there is a target priority in the form of weighted point differentials between targets. Generally, cuts and thrusts to the head and torso count as 2 points, meaning that if you double, so you hit somebody in the arms while they hit you in the head, theoretically, both of you will get points or won't get points based on what target you hit, not what action you were taking before the double happened. So while right-of-way can be really great for giving people credit when doubles happen, regardless of where they hit, you can still put these target priorities in there to make sure that your doubles are resolving in a similar way. At this tournament, the target priority was such that legs were always low priority, meaning that in this theoretical scenario, where my opponent has jumped forward and hit me in the leg with a Krumpau, he would still lose priority despite the fact that my counterattack would have not been the initial attacking action. So, by adding a layer of target priority, you can take away pretty easily the more crazy and insane things that right-of-way allows you to do, while still maintaining the benefits of a right-of-way rule set, namely forcing people into the pocket and rewarding them for clean attacks and clean parry repost kind of fencing, without relying on the ability for people to just kind of bum rush high priority targets or double out by always hitting high priority targets in the afterblow. So hopefully this has been informative. If you still think right-of-way is a really terrible rule set, feel free to yell at me down in the comments, but otherwise, I'll see you next week.